everybody, hope you're doing marvelously well. As ever, please subscribe. You can go to producelikeapro.com, sign up for the email list. You get a whole bunch of free goodies. And of course, we have an academy there with incredible community that helps each other out. It is really supportive and I highly recommend it. Let's get on with Frequently Asked Questions Friday, otherwise known as FAQ Friday. I'm using a supercardioid Sheps mic for my acoustic. What's your opinion on supercardioids for this job? Should I not use it and why? Great question. I like supercardioid microphones. However, what's the reason why I would need one? I use supercardioids in very few situations, but I use them when I'm trying to get away from a lot of bleed. Typically, hyper and supercardioid microphones are really, really good for live applications. Imagine, miking a drum kit and you've got amps all the way around you, bass amps, guitar amps, whatever, and they're super close. You do not want all that ton of bleed that you're going to get from all of the other amps and other instruments. So that's where super and hypercardioid microphones come in. A lot of live microphones now are hyper or supercardioid vocal mics, for instance. So I would want to know, if you're in a room with your acoustic guitar that's super reverberant and you can't deaden it down, then maybe a super would be great. But my only concern would be is if you've got an acoustic guitar player who's maybe doing a little bit of this, then you may well change the sound quite dramatically. The great thing about a regular cardioid, especially a condenser cardioid, is they're a little wider, so there's a little bit more latitude for movement. That's the only pro and con for super and hypercardioids, is that super tight pattern, which is great for live, for vocals, people singing like this, for drum mics, etc. May not translate that well into recording. Now, obviously, if it's a live recording and you've got tons of bleed, then have at it. I'm sure it's going to work and it'll probably give you a great result. A Sheps is a great microphone, but the difference, I should say, between this distance, it's going to be pretty dramatic and you might have a very, very huge tonal change and maybe even quite a big reduction in volume. So that's the thing to really be mindful of when using super or hypercardioid microphones over standard cardioid microphones. Is a Shure SM58 to be a complete no-no on acoustics? Oh no, use 58s all days. There's been so many albums I have made where the 58 is the only spare microphone. When I first started, first of all, an SM58 was on my wish list. I didn't have microphones as good as an SM58. I had Radio Shack mics. Anybody remember that? Or Tandy, growing up in England. Do you remember Tandy in the United Kingdom? And those were really, really cheap microphones. They were like £10 mics, maybe less. And even my first microphones that I bought from a proper music store were probably only 20, 30 or 40 pounds. So a 58 to me was like, whoa, it was like clouds open, a halo came down and there was the 58, we're bringing it to you. An SM58 was an amazing microphone. 58 on anything. To be honest, a good quality dynamic microphone is going to be good on almost everything. Whether it be an SM57 or a 58 or anything of that quality, Biodynamics microphone at that price, Audio-Technica at that price, Lewitz at that price point, and around about $100, $150. It's probably quite good enough to record pretty much every single instrument. You saw us do that with the Sunset Sound recreation of the Van Halen album. You saw the fact they were using 546s with the fixed cables. Not even some of them with the detachable cables. These were fairly inexpensive microphones. Even to this day, they don't go for that much. So hats off to the SM58. If that's all you've got to use on acoustic guitar, go for it. When would you use the roll-off on the mic as opposed to doing in a DAW? When you have access to one. I know that's such a silly thing to say, but it's the truth. Most microphones I use actually don't have high passes on them. They don't. There's quite a few microphones, even some of the best microphones, that don't have high pass. So if it's accessible, then I use it there. I know that Shelley Yakus, one of the greatest engineers that ever lived, likes to high pass and likes to pad microphones at first. So when they come to the mic pre's, they're super quiet. If he's got like a very high output source, he'll pad it and he'll high pass it. And then when it comes to the mic pre, it's super clean. He can boost it. He produces and creates and captures, most importantly, a really big, fat sound without any kind of distortion, without any interference, at source. So it's more of a question of, do you have a microphone that has high passing on it? And if you do, check it out. And if it sounds good at source, it's the right kind of area. Maybe it's 100 at maximum, more like an 80 or something in that area. It's probably going to be usable on most situations. So otherwise, a lot of microphones I use don't have high passing on them, so I am doing it in the DAW. What kind of mic setup would you suggest for recording brass instruments? Now, this is an interesting one because a lot of people traditionally look at ribbon microphones for brass. That's great, as long as you're not blowing into them. I mean, the reason why we think about ribbons is because we go back to a time when ribbons were the only mics available. And you go back to, or the main mics available. And you go back to like some of the jazz recordings of the 30s in particular, maybe early 40s, just as condensers were coming in. Because remember, the U47 is a microphone that came in post Second World War. So if you think about jazz recordings up until the mid-late 40s, those all would have been done with predominantly, not entirely, but predominantly done with ribbons. Now, ribbons sound great on brass as long as they're not blowing straight into them, because the sound pressure levels that a ribbon can take are nowhere near as much as definitely a dynamic or even a condenser. So if you are going to use ribbon mics on brass, make sure they are there to accent, not to directly get it. So let's just say there's a horn blowing down here. Pull that mic back. Do not get it in the path of the huge amount of air coming out of a horn. For instance, blowing a trumpet into a ribbon will probably completely destroy it. I mean, the SPL from a trumpet directly out of that is insane. So, firstly, yes, you can use ribbons. Yes, you can use condensers. I know that Tom Scott loved 414s and loved my KM56 on his trumpet. Or not his trumpet, but on the trumpet player that when we were tracking with Tom on the Aerosmith record. We've used them a few times, and he loves really expensive condensers, but they're never blown directly into it. So if a trumpet player is playing down like this, the KM56 was getting an accent of it, not a direct off it. It might reflect off of the bell, so here's the bell, so it might get the sound coming off of it, but it's never directly into it. If you put a really nice mic directly into it, especially an expensive tube, small diaphragm condenser like a KM56, that's a Neumann KM56, you will cause all kinds of problems. Again, very high sound pressure levels. So you can see where I'm leading. Ribbons, never directly, not even close. Condensers, indirectly, reflected sound to a certain extent. You know where we're going. Things like RE20s get used a lot. They are a large, basically, they're a dynamic microphone. You see them a lot on brass sections because they can take a lot of abuse. RE20s, EVs, I see a lot of EV mics. Basically, I would experiment with using, depending on your mic locker, I would experiment with using condensers and dynamics and ribbons. But basically, if you want direct sound and you're trying to get separation, dynamics are going to be good because they're going to have tighter polar patterns. If you're trying to get a more overall sound of 3 or 4 players, then probably a pair of, condenser and stereo pair. And then if you're trying to get the sound of a whole section with 1 or 2 microphones pulled back a lot further, probably a pair of ribbons, especially because they're figure of 8, you'll get the room. So sort of in that order, very close dynamics, slightly back condensers, much further back ribbons. That's sort of my philosophy when I'm thinking about recording brass players. Do you have an opinion of USB versus analog microphones? Great question. I think USB microphones are wonderful, and if it's going to get you starting to make music by just plugging straight into a USB and not having to buy an interface, not being able to afford an interface, for instance, then do it. Do I think an interface with a really nice mic pre, like an Audient or something like that, I use those all the time. If it's an ID14 with a mic plugged into it, great. You're going to get a really tasty sounding mic pre that we love, that makes great records, but that's a $200-300 commitment, as well as a microphone, which can be, anywhere from $60, $70 to $300. That's, you're basically talking $200 to $500 commitment, as opposed to a USB mic, which I've seen for significantly less than $100, and you just plug straight into your laptop or your tower. So if it's a question, and I imagine the question is, can I make a record and make good recordings without spending a fortune on an interface and a microphone? I think that is a good question, and to answer, yes, you can. USB microphones are a quick and easy, inexpensive solution. It's going to be more about almost like harping back to the brass. Think about mic placement. If you've got a USB microphone, you're putting it in front of a Marshall stack going at full-blown 100 watts, the whole thing cranked, it's probably not a great solution. You're going to need to bring the mic back. If you're singing vocals on a USB, you can get amazing results. Just make sure you have a pop screen in the way and you pull back enough and you're not singing, death metal like into it. It's more about like logically thinking, some of the cheaper things don't have quite the tolerances, the sound pressure levels. If you want to get into it, I'm sure as a beginner you aren't going to understand this, but if you do want to get into some of these things, you can look at the technical specs and see what the SPL is. What is the sound pressure level that a microphone can take? And you'll probably find that most of you, at least the inexpensive USBs, don't quite have that same sound pressure level as some of the more expensive ones. Otherwise, go use it. If that's what's going to get you making music, please use a USB microphone and start making music. How do they do the recordings of an orchestra at the studio in terms of channels and mics? Well, it's a great question. As you know, a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago now, we were in London for the UAD event where they had Two Door Cinema Club, and they had an orchestra being recorded at Air Studios by Olga Fitzroy. Olga is incredibly talented. Credits are unbelievable. So she's recorded a lot of orchestras there. She's done Radiohead stuff and all kinds of stuff. And I don't know if you remember the video. If not, there will be a link flying around somewhere here. She had accent miking over all of the different sections, which is basically if you've got like 3 or 4 violins, you've got a microphone or a pair of microphones over all of them to get a joint thing. And that sounded phenomenal. But in the room, what she was mainly playing was the decatry, which was the microphones in the center, just slightly in front of the conductor, and they were picking up the whole of the thing. The reality is 2 or 3 microphones really, really well placed, a pair pointed out like this and a mono in omni down the middle, was mainly the sound of the orchestra. She muted everything except for those 3 microphones, and then we put the timpani in, and it was phenomenal. Now, why is that? It's a combination of the microphones in the right place, number one. That is the number one most important thing. Number 2, great room, equally important. But don't forget number 3. Number 3 is players, orchestral musicians that know how to play balanced within themselves and together. So basically they all played. If you're standing in the middle of the room, which I had the blessing to be able to do, to stand in that room when they're playing, it sounds like, close your eyes, a record. Everybody is playing at the right dynamics. It's not the going to the local bar where the lead guitarist has his Marshall stack, once again, twice talking about Marshall stacks on maximum, but so loud that you can't hear anything but the lead guitar player. It's not that situation. It is a musician playing inside of the blend. When the girl singer at the end of that sings, oh, this line, in the room, you could hear her. It was like a pin could drop. It was perfect. They were playing with her vocal just sitting above it. The orchestra was with her. So, 3 things. Amazing mic placement, great room, incredible musicians that know how to play balance with each other. Those are the secrets of orchestral recording, and all 3 of those could be reordered. Obviously, great musicians in a great room could be number 1. Number 2 could be the great room, sorry, to repeat myself. Number 3 could be the mic placement. Ultimately, it's those things combined. Because if any one of those 3 is wrong, it's not going to sound good. You can play within yourself, but if the room is horrible and it just doesn't work, you'll spend your whole life trying to figure out where to place the microphones. If you put the microphones in the wrong place in a great room with great musicians, it's going to sound bad too. It's going to be like whatever you were closer to. So those 3 things are what makes a great orchestral recording. And those are the number 1 things. When you're talking about channels and mics, having the same mic pre is going to be really, really good because the transients are going to translate Transients translate. That was a good one. The transients are going to translate equally, so things will feel like they're all coming at you at the same time. So a console is definitely the best way to go when multi-miking anything, when you're recording drums. Having 8, 10, 12, 16, 24, whatever mic pre's that are equal to each other is always going to sound best, at least in my humble opinion and most people's opinion. That's why they like consoles for recording drums, for instance. Same goes to orchestras. Microphones, you can get a little bit cleverer, but when you're doing with stereo pairs, you want them to be a pair of the same microphone. With the Decatree, I'm sure, at least the left and right were the same, and then the center could be a different Omni. You want those left and right to be the same microphone, so they hear it in the same kind of way. I noticed that you use Audient preamps a lot. What about your 1173? Well, I'll make this short and sweet. I use both. We use the Audient, but we also use the 1173 because it has a mic pre that I love, that I helped design, and has a wonderful compressor based on 1176, my favorite ever compressor, one of the, if not the most used compressor ever. So it's a wonderful combination. So we sort of do both. The thing that I think about the 1173 is it has a ton of color, and the Audient definitely has a little bit of color, i.e. it sounds like a good preamp. But in terms of comparing that to 1173, it's more of a capture it in a really accurate way. The 1173 is giving everything a little bit more oomph. There's a little bit more lows in it. There is the potential to have a little bit more saturation if you drive the mic pre, and of course it has a compressor in there, which I love the sound of, and there's 2 transformers, input and output transformers, which add a little bit more weight to the signal. So for me, it's moving between both of those worlds. And of course, as ever, there'll be links for the 1173 flying around here. All right, last but no means least, is there any advantage to using plugins in the audio interface during tracking versus plugins in the DAW? That's really, really cool. I think that we're going to do more on this. One of the beauties are, and as you can tell, I'm not biased towards any particular company. In the same phrase of talking about mic preamps in Audient and then talking about the UK Sound 1173, I'm now going to talk about, in the same video, UAD. One of the things that we love about UAD, and I think that is really good to talk about, is that their ability to track through their plugins, that they have an almost, not entirely because it's not possible, at least not yet, 0 latency. So you can choose different analog emulations. So when you talk about using, say, maybe a UAD interface with their plugins, that's a huge deal because, yes, you can track through their emulations of their Neves. More importantly, of course, UAD, being Universal Audio, has access to LA2As, 1176s, and they have modeling of their own equipment that they designed. That Bill Putnam's father, Bill Putnam Sr., I presume is the best way of describing it, that his father designed and built. So there's a legacy there I love, and there's no latency, which I love. Legacy and latency in the same sentence. So I definitely believe that that is one advantage of going, and look, we know it's more expensive. You're paying for the privilege of having their audio interface and all of those great plugins. It's about like with like. It's about understanding that there is incredible gear at lots of different price points, whether it's talking about the Kali speakers at less than $300 a pair, the Focals at like just over $2,000, or of course my beloved Genelix at a few thousand more. Everything has their place, and it's knowing when something is incredibly good value for money at that price point. So UAD is definitely more expensive than the Audient stuff. You are paying for those incredible plugins. So if you do want to track through those incredible sounds, that's where UAD is going to win. So yes, my long answer to your question is, you're hinting at that because they really are the guys that do that. That's where they win. That's where UAD win. They win on those plugins. And then secondly, you could quite easily, and I do all the time, use your Audient, track through that, and then of course open up any number of different plugins and do it afterwards. But it comes down to, are you trying to get the sound there and then move on to something else, or are you always leaving it to mixing? That's kind of the do or die situation. Are you trying to print a sound, or are you going to figure it out later? And I personally prefer printing it the way I want to hear it. It makes mixing easier, but not only does it make mixing easier, it makes producing easier, because then I choose a sound that I want and then add something to it based on that. All right, everybody. Thank you ever so much for watching. As ever, please subscribe, go to Produce Like a Pro, download the free stuff, and of course join our wonderful mailing list, and there's tons of giveaways. I think that the Focal is going to be going, so check that out. Just have a marvelous time recording and mixing, and we'll see you all again very, very soon.